Hi, and welcome to our live chat on everything drone related. My name is Kevin Morris, and I'm an aviation safety inspector with the FAA and also a subject matter expert on drone operations. I'm joined today by John Page from FAA Air Traffic. John, tell us a little bit about what you do with the FAA.
Hi everyone, as Kevin said, my name is John Page and I work in the FAA Air Traffic Organization. I'm an air traffic control specialist, and my areas of expertise are related to unmanned aircraft operations and how they interact with air traffic control facilities.
Excellent. So you got a couple of really good subject matter experts here for our drone community out there to ask questions of. Today we are broadcasting live from Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. And if you have questions, you can send them to us via any of those platforms. So I think before we get started, one thing I wanted to touch on is a couple of terms that we're going to be using throughout the live chat here. The first is Part 107. When we reference Part 107, John, we're going to be talking about those flyers who are operating under Part 107 of our rule, who are issued an airman certificate and are flying under that portion. The other term we will use is recreational flyer. And when we use the term recreational flyers, we're talking about those pilots who are flying their drones recreationally under the exception for limited recreational operations, which I think came into effect last October with the FAA Reauthorization Act. So keep in mind those two terms we'll be using throughout the live Q&A here today as we move forward. So what do you say we start answering questions?
Let's do it.
All right, here we go. First question coming in, looks like I'll take this one, John. The question is, do I have to register my drone before I fly? And the answer is, well, it depends. If your UAS weighs more than 0.55 pounds, you'll need to register it with the FAA. Registration costs $5 and is done through our website on our Drone Zone portal. The registration is going to be valid for 3 years. And to go back to some of those terms I mentioned earlier, if you're flying under Part 107, you'll need a unique registration number for each one of your drones that you're flying. If you're flying as a recreational flyer, you can use the same registration number on all of your drones. So thank you for asking that question, because that is something we do get asked quite a bit. The next one, John, it's for you. It's a little bit of an open-ended question. The question is, where can I fly my drone?
Wow. Yeah, that is kind of open-ended, but you know, there's an awful lot of airspace within the United States that you can operate your drone. Whether you're operating under the recreational rules or whether you're operating under Part 107, as Kevin referenced earlier, kind of determines where you can fly and what the requirements are. If you're operating in controlled airspace, under the recreational rule and under Part 107, as long as you comply with the requirements of those rules, you can operate 400 feet and below without any additional authorization from the FAA. However, if you're going to venture into controlled airspace, then you have a requirement under both rules to receive an authorization prior to your starting to operate that particular aircraft.
Yep, great, good answer, and great question that you sent in. Thank you for that. Another one coming in here ties in a little bit about what you just mentioned there, John. So where can I find information about where I can and cannot fly in California? I checked the FAA website, and sounds like just to fly recreationally, I need to get a license. But I was talking with a rep from a local hobby store and was told that I don't need to do any of that as long as it's for recreation. Well, I think, John, you answered the first part about that, is how to try to figure out where you can and can't fly. So I'll sort of take the second one. If you're flying as a recreational flyer, under the exception for limited recreational operations, you do not need a license from the FAA to do so. Currently, the way we have the rules implemented from the congressional mandate is that if you're flying recreationally, we ask that you follow the safety guidelines of an aero modeling organization. And if you want to know more about that, you can visit our website at faa.gov/UAS. We also have a YouTube video on this very specific topic for recreational flyers. You can also watch that video. And it will explain sort of where we are here in the interim between the requirement that we have these new recreational rules and the final implementation of that rule. So that is also a great question. Next one here, John, I'm going to send this one to you. What is the difference with Lance as a recreational flyer versus a Part 107 flyer?
That's a really good question also. So Lance is the low altitude authorization and notification capability. And it's a system where you can go in and receive real near-time responses to your request for authorizations to operate either under the recreational rule now or under Part 107. We recently implemented the changes in Lance where you can do an authorization from the recreational aspect. As far as functionally, there are very few differences in Lance from a recreational perspective versus a Part 107 perspective. So when you go in and you actually request your authorizations, you wouldn't see too many differences other than the possibility that you may notice that further coordination is not available under the recreational operations versus it is available under the Part 107.
Great, and I think it's been widely rejoiced that Lance finally came available for recreational flyers. I know for Part 107 operators, that was sort of a big day as we rolled that out in different waves. It was very well received by the community, right. And we've had a lot of positive feedback on that. I did want to follow up on something you mentioned, a little bit about further coordination. What does that mean, further coordination?
So further coordination means that if you want to operate at an altitude that's above the unmanned aircraft system facility maps, then you can request further coordination. However, as I stated, under the recreational operations, that function is not available through the UAS service supplier.
I gotcha. So that's probably one of the key differences, because you mentioned really from a user standpoint, there's not really a lot of difference on the user end of using Lance. But when we're talking about further coordination requests, you want to fly at 300 feet in a 100-foot grid. You'll need to do that under Part 107 because you would not be able to do that as a recreational flyer. Is that correct?
That's correct.
All right, great. Thank you for clearing that up. Next question coming in. Looks like I'll handle this one here. It ties in a little bit to the registration portion. The question is, do I need a separate FAA registration for every drone? I already have an RC plane registered and marked, and I just got a DJI Spark. Do I need to make a new registration, or can I just copy the number? Great question. If you're flying recreationally, meaning you're operating under the exception for limited recreational operations, you can use one registration number on all your drones that you fly recreationally. And if you remember, I talked a little bit about Part 107 registration earlier. If you're flying under Part 107 and using, let's say, both of those aircraft under Part 107, you would need to have unique registration numbers for each one. So flying recreationally, you can use the same registration number on all your drones. So thank you for asking that one. John, another Lance question coming in for you here. This one is, does Lance mean that they don't have to call the airport, or should they call the airport? What happens when I get a Lance authorization that says, okay, you can fly?
So one of the reasons that we implemented Lance is so that you didn't have to call the airport. It allows you to receive your authorization without directly coordinating with a particular air traffic control facility. And we don't want you to contact the facility. We want you to go through Lance, because what happens is if you contact the facility directly, that can become a distraction to the facility itself. And obviously the air traffic controllers and the staff there are busy doing the functions that they have to as an air traffic control facility. So we've implemented Lance so that you can do it through that system rather than coordinating with the air traffic facility.
Excellent. Next question we have coming in is from Facebook. John asked, does a visual observer meet the requirement for maintaining line of sight, even if the pilot in command loses sight of the drone temporarily? So there's a couple ways to answer this, and I'm assuming that John is referencing Part 107. When using a visual observer or when flying under Part 107, it's always required that either the remote pilot in command or the visual observer has visual line of sight on the UAS at all times. And we sort of employ visual observers so that if the pilot in command, the person who's flying the drone, has to look down or maybe do some telemetry data, the visual observer would be there to see the aircraft itself so that somebody is always watching that aircraft. And it's sort of the same under the recreational flyer rules, that the visual observer has to be there to, especially if you're flying under FPV or first-person view, you have to employ a visual observer there who's next to you and in direct communication. So visual observers are a great safety mitigation, meaning they really help reduce the risk of your flying when you're flying either a drone for under Part 107 or recreationally, that somebody's always looking at the drone and scanning the area for traffic. So we highly recommend using visual observers. So thank you, John, for that question. If you're just joining us, we're hosting a live chat on everything drone related. We're broadcasting on social media platforms like Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube, and you can send us your questions on any of those platforms. We're generally talking about two types of operations, Part 107 and recreational flyer. And just as a reminder, when we're talking Part 107, we're talking those pilots flying under the rule. They've been issued an airman certificate under Part 107. When we mention the term recreational flyer or recreation, we're referencing those folks flying under sort of the new rules, as we're calling them, for recreational flyers, titled the exception for limited recreational operations. So we have another question coming in here. I think I'm going to shoot this one over to you, John.
Okay.
The question is from Jesse on Instagram, and the question is, do state parks have jurisdiction over their airspace?
Wow. Thanks for the question, Jesse. So state parks have jurisdiction over the land. The FAA is designated authority through Congress to manage the airspace above any area, regardless of who owns that particular land. So the answer to the question is the FAA manages the airspace, the Park Service or whoever it is or the county, they manage the land itself. So they are allowed to implement rules related to the land itself, but not the airspace.
Yeah, I think it's a great way to answer that. We do get that question quite a bit on national parks and people wanting to fly their drones there, and they're wondering what they can and can't do. If you have those questions about airspace and land use and permission, please send those in. We do have a great group of legal folks who specialize in UAS.
Absolutely.
And can provide very solid answers for you folks, because again, you're not the first person to ask that question. We do get it quite a bit. I think right here, I'm going to ask this question and send it back to you here, John. This is from ZStaples22 on Instagram. They ask, how do you notify an airport through LANS? And so I don't if I think maybe what they're saying is, does LANS notify the airport, or how does that system sort of work?
Okay, so the person who requests the authorization through LANS is not responsible for the notification to the airport. So the facility itself, the air traffic control facility, when an authorization is issued, then that copy of that authorization is forwarded to the air traffic control facility through the LANS system. So the air traffic control facility knows when an authorization has been issued, and they already have that information, so you don't have a requirement to do that. As far as notification to the airport itself, under the new rules, it does not specify that a notification to the airport is required. You're simply required to get an authorization through the air traffic organization within the FAA. And that's what LANS serves as that means to get that authorization.
Yeah, and I think that's an important point to make too. For a lot of our viewers that have been flying drones a long time, you probably remember a requirement that we had, that you had to notify airport operators if you were flying within 5 miles of an airport as a recreational flyer. That is no longer a requirement, as John, as you were just pointing out there. And part of the reason is because we were able to implement LANS for recreational flyers. So in a sense, that notification is still being given. It's just being given through LANS rather than you having to send an additional email or pick up the phone and call the tower. So
right.
It's sort of streamlined that process for recreational flyers for sure. Next question coming in here from Facebook. This is from Ben. Ben asks, when will the FAA create the aeronautical knowledge for recreational flyers? Great question, Ben. And I'm assuming you're talking about the aeronautical knowledge and safety test that was mandated by Congress.
I think I'll let you take that one.
Are you sure?
Yeah,
okay,
pretty sure.
So Ben, that is something that we are working diligently on. Quite frankly, every day I'm part of a group and we're working on developing that test. As you can imagine, the test is something that a lot of people are asking us about. It was a requirement that Congress put in the limited recreational operations exception, and we need to get that to you folks right away. The good news is that we've partnered with industry. We've had some roundtable discussions with industry on test, what information, what are the important things that we need to have in there, and we're really doing what we feel is an excellent job in creating this test so that's informative for you folks, that you folks can take it, that it's not going to be a huge burden on you. So I can't promise you a date right now, or if I did, I'd probably get in a little bit of trouble. but we are definitely working on that as quickly as we can to get you get you folks that information right away. Be rest assured, if you follow us on any of our social media platforms, you'll know right away when that test becomes available, because there will be a lot of advertising and information going out about that test as we near the date. But yes, we are definitely working on that, and stay tuned. So I'll jump in here. Another question here. John, I'm going to send this one to you this time. Stan from Facebook asks, is there an app for Lance?
So there is not a specific application for Lance itself. However, we do have the UAS service suppliers, and the UAS service suppliers and the FAA have partnered together to allow you a method to receive your authorizations. And those service suppliers have individual apps that they use through them, but what we recommend is that you go to the UAS website. There is a list of the service suppliers there, and it also lists what services they provide, whether they provide services under Part 107 or the limited recreational. So that's the best place to go to find the information related to how you get involved in using Lance for an authorization.
So I shouldn't go to like the App Store or Google Play or something and look for Lance and try to download that. There's no app for Lance. It's these companies or service suppliers we've agreed with.
Right, that's correct. So if you looked up Lance in any of those areas, you would not find anything.
All right, excellent. This question is coming in on Instagram from Jesse, and Jesse asks, why do we get tested on flying in rough weather for the commercial Part 107 test? I should probably take that one.
I think so, yeah.
Jesse, great question. We get a lot of questions on the aeronautical knowledge test for Part 107 operators, asking us, why do I need to know this, or why do I need to know that? When you're flying a drone in the National Airspace System, your aircraft is subject to the same weather conditions that manned aircraft are. It's important to know that you, as a remote pilot in command under Part 107, need to be aware of the weather conditions that are around your area or that could potentially impact your area. So things like thunderstorm development and formation, that's important to know if you're flying and you're away from weather and being able to understand what's happening in the atmosphere, or things like mechanical turbulence, which is wind coming off of buildings and swirling around. That's going to have an effect on your drone. So weather is an absolutely critical part of flying your drone in the National Airspace System, which is why we ask those questions on the aeronautical knowledge test. So thank you for asking that question, Jesse. I appreciate it. Another question coming in here, John, this will be for you. This is Josh from Facebook. He asks, is there a way to request authorization easily to fly above 400 feet when not in any restricted airspace? Just thought I would ask.
Great, thanks Josh for asking. So under Part 107, you can do that. I don't know if I'd term it as easy, but there is a process in place for you to do that. And that is a 107-51 Bravo waiver, and that is the paragraph that speaks to the altitude restriction of 400 feet in the rule, and that's why that number is always referenced. So you do that through Drone Zone, and Drone Zone is one of our other websites where you can go in. That's where you register your aircraft, where you get all the information about your aircraft. You also request operational waivers through that, and in this case, the 107-51 Bravo waiver would be an operational waiver. And you go in and you tell us where you want to fly, why you want to fly, what your safety mitigations are, and you submit that request. And then it will be evaluated by the flight standards side of the FAA and also the air traffic side of the FAA. And then we'll get you a response as quickly as we can.
And I think it might be a good point to bring up some of the differences here, as long as we're talking about that altitude waiver, is what you're referencing there. Not to get too far into the weeds, but if I'm a Part 107 flyer and I see that the UAS facility map has a 100-foot grid ceiling limit on it, but I need to get up to 150 feet to do my flight, whether, let's say, I'm doing some photography work or videography work. Do I request a waiver for that, or would that be a further coordination request I can do through Lance as a Part 107 flyer?
So if you're talking about operating above the UAS facility map altitude, but below 400 feet, then you would submit that either through Lance for further coordination under Part 107, or if you're also operating under 107, but the facility that you want to fly near isn't implemented in Lance yet, you can request that through Drone Zone, and that would be if you're above the facility map altitude but below 400 feet, that would be an airspace authorization request.
Okay.
And you would simply state that you wanted to fly above the altitude on the map. And then we would coordinate that with the air traffic control facility and determine whether we can allow that operation to occur or not.
Gotcha. So maybe a real good description of when I would need to apply for that altitude waiver would be is if I was flying within Class Delta airspace, and let's say that the top of the grid was 300 feet, but I need to go up to 600 feet to do my mission. In that case, I'm going to need a couple of things. One, I'm going to need an altitude waiver because I'm going above 400 feet, right?
Correct.
But then I would also need an airspace authorization from air traffic as well?
Yes, but those would be done together. You would submit them as an altitude waiver and an airspace authorization. However, when we coordinated them, we would coordinate the two together, and we would issue one single document to tell you what altitude you can fly to.
Great. All right, thank you. The next question coming in from Facebook is from Michael. Michael asks, how different is the recurrent knowledge test or the renewal compared to the first time taking the exam? So I'm assuming Michael's talking about the Part 107.
Right.
You have an initial aeronautical knowledge test, and we have a recurrent knowledge test for Part 107 operators. And is this where I provide all the test questions to everybody out there and the answers?
You stomp your foot so you tell them which
That's
ones are
right.
important.
Michael, clearly I can't give you the test questions and the answers and exactly what's on the test. But Part 107 documents what exactly, at least the topics that we're going to be asking on the initial and the recurrent test. And certainly there are some differences, but that's not simply because one's recurrent maybe and one's initial. We're constantly evaluating the test. We look at perhaps the questions that get missed. If we have a question that everybody seems to be missing, we take a look at that question and try to figure out, is it a bad question? Do we need to reword it? Or as other topics come up that we feel are important for UAS operators to know, we can add those in. But believe me, it's not as simple as just, well, I think this is important, I'm going to type up a question and add it to the test. It goes through a fairly detailed and in-depth process when we either remove or add any questions to that test. So hopefully the questions that you're getting are meaningful and important for what you're doing. But there are definitely differences between the two tests, and you can take a look at Part 107 to find out. You might even be able to talk to other people that have taken the test and talk to them about their experience with the test. I recommend over-preparing for any test, and that's simply going to make you more aware of everything you need to know. So it's not really something I recommend like to study just for the test. As a professional drone operator or somebody flying under 107 and wants to do things the right way, make sure you're reviewing all the information. Go ahead and refresh your brain on everything you learned the first time around, and the recurrent test should be pretty much a breeze for you at that point as well. So
right, it isn't about just passing the test, right? It's about operating safely in the NAS.
That's absolutely right. Absolutely, that's our goal for everything here. So thank you, John. Let's see. We had a question in here from Chad on YouTube, and this is going to be one for you, John.
Okay.
The Appleton International Airport in Wisconsin isn't listed as Lance capable. I'm looking to get an authorization through the Lance system. How do I do this through AirMap, which is one of our service suppliers? But right. I think you might have touched on that a little bit earlier.
Yeah. So if Appleton is not Lance enabled, then you would not be able to request that authorization through Lance. What you would have to do is you would have to go into Drone Zone, as I mentioned earlier, which is one of our websites, and you would request your authorization through Drone Zone rather than Lance. There are a number of facilities that we still do not have in Lance yet. We are working on that and looking to do that in the future, but currently, if the facility is not in Lance, then what you would need to do is request that 10741 authorization through Drone Zone.
And I think maybe it's important to note as well that if they're requesting through Drone Zone, it's not going to be a near real-time authorization that they get back, right? There's going to be some processing involved, so maybe request that a little bit further in advance rather than the morning of.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a manually coordinated process. So if you go into Drone Zone and you submit your application, that application goes to one of the FAA offices, and then they take it and they compare it to the facility map. And if it's above the altitudes in the map, then they coordinate it directly with, in this case, Appleton, to see if they can approve the operation. So it is a time-intensive process. So we do recommend that you submit it at least 60 days in advance if you can.
Okay, great. Another question coming in here on Facebook this time from Howard. Howard asks, a lot of my drone flights are promotional videos made at 20 feet or below. How can I do this in restricted airspace? So I'll start to answer, but this is also a little bit of your wheelhouse here, John, with airspace. Assuming that you're doing these promotional videos, you would need to do them under Part 107. Now, where I get a little bit tripped up on the questions when you mentioned restricted airspace, because a lot of people have the tendency to mix the terms restricted airspace and controlled airspace.
Right.
And, I think we want to maybe address a couple things. John has mentioned a few times, if you're operating in controlled airspace, you need to submit your airspace authorization request either through LANC or drone zone, as John was just pointing out, if LANC is not available yet. But in terms of restricted airspace, how does that work? Do you have a good suggested tip for him if you're flying in truly restricted airspace?
Right. So if you're operating in truly restricted airspace, which is airspace that's been designated as an operation that will occur in there as hazardous. So we do not allow civil operations in there without approval from the controlling authority or the using authority. And in this case, probably the best way to find that information is on the Visualize It website, which is our website that has all the UAS facility maps listed on it. There are layers. And you can actually select the layers that you want to see on the website. And one of those layers is restricted airspace. And it will tell you what the restricted airspace number is and who the controlling agency is. And you can actually do coordination with that controlling agency to determine if you can operate in there or not. It's not a matter of coordinating directly with the FAA through LANC or drone zone. You have to get those permissions through the controlling agency that manages that particular restricted area.
So he shouldn't expect a near real-time authorization for restricted airspace as well. Okay, good. Well, I think we're going to stay on this term of authorizations and LANC. I'm going to send another question here to you. This is from Sam on Facebook, and he asks, can I get a long-term authorization to fly under Part 107 at my facility, which is in a 0-foot ceiling area on approach to a Class Delta, Class D airport? I would like to avoid having to repeatedly request authorization since the hard copy application is much slower than LANC. Hard copy meaning probably drone zone.
Right, through drone zone. So as a general rule, we are not allowing long-term authorizations for areas, for facilities that are serviced through LANC. However, if your facility is not serviced through LANC and there are certain things that you have, for example, if you're operating using an operational waiver for operations over people, we know that through LANC you can't request an authorization if you have that operational waiver. So what we've done is we've made exceptions for those so that you would go through drone zone, request your operation, and then we would write you a long-term authorization. However, if your facility is serviced in LANC, we are not writing long-term authorizations because what we're trying to do is allow people to do the near-time authorizations through LANC as a general rule.
So then let me do a couple follow-ups with you here. If the facility is not in LANC, meaning they have to go through drone zone, can they do long-term authorizations that way, or are we sort of treating it the same way as if it were a LANC airport?
So generally we're treating them the same as if it were a LANC airport, and we're writing those authorizations for a one-day period, basically 12 hours. But like I said, there are some exceptions to those, and those have to do with whether you have an operational waiver, whether it be night ops or operations over people, those types of things. But as a general rule, we're doing short-term authorizations.
Gotcha, good. Thanks for that information. Question coming in on YouTube from Philip. Philip is asking us, what are some tips to applying for a daylight waiver? Any keywords that should be addressed to successfully receive one? Philip, I'll take this one finally. A question here for me, kind of in my area. Philip, there's no keywords that we're recommending you put in there. Despite maybe what you've heard, we don't just do a quick search for keywords and approve or deny waivers. we have actually an entire series hosted by yours truly on our FAA YouTube page regarding how to apply for an operational waiver. I take you through the initial steps of the application process, what safety and risk mitigation means, and then I actually go into a two-part episode on specific daylight waiver application requests. And I think if you take a look at those videos, you're going to be off to a great start on applying for a daylight waiver. So no specific keywords that I'm going to throw out there to say, hey, put this or don't put that. But if you take a look at those videos on our YouTube channel, you're going to be off to a great start on your initial application for a daylight waiver. So thank you so much, Phil, for asking that question. I appreciate that. John, a question coming in from David. David asks, how high can my drone go before I need to get an authorization from Lance?
Thanks for the question, David. So basically, it isn't a matter of height, it's a matter of location. So if you're operating in uncontrolled airspace, and you can operate up to 400 feet without getting any additional authorizations or permissions from the Air Traffic Control Organization within the FAA. However, if you're operating in the controlled airspace that we spoke about, then you do have a requirement to get an authorization before you fly. It doesn't matter how high you operate that drone, you still have a requirement.
Yeah, great. And if you're just joining us, we're hosting a live chat on everything drone related. I'm joined by John Page from FAA Air Traffic, and I'm Kevin Morris, an Aviation Safety Inspector with the FAA. We're broadcasting on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube, and you can send us any of your questions on any of those platforms. We're generally speaking to two types of pilot groups here today. Those flying under Part 107 of our rules, which means you have an airman certificate, you have a remote pilot certificate, and those flying recreationally, which are those operating under the exception for limited recreational operations, or kind of the new recreational rules that people are talking about out there. So a couple of terms that we're using again and again. A question coming in here, this one is on Facebook. We're getting a lot of questions, you guys. It's a little bit difficult to keep up, but these are all really good questions. I thank you for joining us. Alexis on Facebook asks, arriving to the U.S. through customs, do I need to take any special documents with me? I'm planning to visit the U.S. as a recreational flyer. I have an FAA number plate already. I have the Before You Fly app. I have a special lithium battery bags. Anything else that comes to your mind? Boy, Alexis, that's really a good question, and unfortunately a little bit outside of my direct area of knowledge and expertise. But don't fret. We will take that question and we'll get it to the right person to provide you an answer on that one, because I want to make sure that you don't run into any problems going through customs in the U.S. I don't want me to be the source of any bad intel on that. So we're going to take that question and we'll answer it with our different subject matter experts who are much more versed in U.S. customs operations and traveling with drones and things like that. So thanks for that question. Apologies I can't answer that one live. So let's see this one here. This is from YouTube. This is from LO. Where does the delineation between public airspace and private airspace fall? Example, flying over unpopulated private property, flying over a home. John, you want to try to tackle this one? I can jump on afterward.
Yeah, I can tackle it from a general discussion standpoint. I'm not an attorney, but from an airspace perspective, the FAA has been delegated authority by Congress to manage the airspace over the United States. There is no actual term of private airspace versus public airspace. All of the airspace belongs to the citizens of the United States and is managed by the Federal Aviation Administration per Congress's direction.
So you're trying to tell me I don't own the airspace above my backyard?
That is correct.
Oh boy, oh boy. Well, I'll stop asking questions on that because I know where that might end.
Yeah, and that's why I said I'm not an attorney. So going beyond that is beyond my my level of discussion.
Gotcha. Yeah, very, very good. John, another question coming in, but I think this one will be for me. This is Roger on YouTube, and Roger's asking, can a Part 107 drone pilot who has several drones registered under 107 also have other drones that are only used recreationally and use recreational registration? Roger, this is an excellent question. What we're looking at here with registration is if you have a registration under Part 107, mean, let's say you have 5 drones in a scenario I'm going to give you here, and you fly all of those under Part 107. Each one of those drones would have to have a unique registration number on it. You could still then fly those drones recreationally under the exception because they would meet the registration requirements. They all have a registration number on it. Going the other way isn't so simple. For example, if I was a recreational flyer and I owned 5 drones and I was just flying them recreationally, so I had that one registration number on all of my drones, I would not be able to take those drones and fly them under Part 107 because under Part 107, each one has to have a unique registration number. So registered under Part 107, go ahead and fly them recreationally under the exception. If you've registered them as a recreational drone and they all have the same number, you would not be able to move those and fly those under Part 107 without doing an additional registration. I always like to remind people when we talk about registration too that registration costs $5 through our website and it's valid for 3 years. You should not need to be paying any more than $5 to register any of your drones. So in my example I just gave, if I had 5 drones and I flew those all under Part 107, it would be $5 per drone, and if my math still works in my head, that'd be $25. That would be valid for 3 years. If I flew all those drones recreationally, all those 5 drones, remember I just need one registration number, it would be $5 to register all of them because they would share that same number. So thank you for that question, Roger. It's a very good one here. Let's see, I'll scroll through here. The questions are kind of coming in, and I know we're getting a little short on time. So let's see. John, I'm going to give this one to you. This question comes in via Twitter, and Peter asks, we want to fly a drone over a university, but the university said no. Do they own the airspace? I think we might have touched on that earlier.
Yeah, we did in a little bit. So the airspace above the university is not owned by the university. It is a public asset. It's owned by the United States citizens overall. However, you still do require an authorization if it's in controlled airspace. And so you would have to go through that process. The university, however, does own, assuming they own the land that the university is on, they can make rules based on that particular ownership of the land itself. So in other words, if they wanted to say, well, we don't want drones launching or landing on our campus, then they do have authority to do that. But they do not have authority to restrict the airspace necessarily over it.
Yeah, and again, that's a good point. And just like we answered that before, and keep in mind we're not a couple of attorneys sitting here, but right. That's our general understanding of how this all works. And if you want to send that question in, we'll get it to our attorneys. I think you'll get the same answer, but maybe with a little more legalese if you need that information. But one of the things I want to mention as we're talking about who owns the airspace and who owns the ground, remember that we're all trying to do this professionally. We all want to see the UAS community, drones, we all want to see you folks succeed and grow, and part of that requires a partnership with a lot of different individuals or organizations, as we're talking about here today. So if the university is saying, we don't want you flying a drone from our campus, it may not be the greatest idea to say, well, I know you don't own the airspace, so I'm going to fly over it anyway. I just never. We want to make sure that the drone industry is growing and growing in a positive light. It's far too easy, I think, for people to look at drones and see them in a negative light. But we here at the FAA understand the importance, the growth. It's a fantastic industry that's really growing by leaps and bounds. And the way we continue that growth is to make sure that we're flying friendly and we're doing things a safe way. So keep that in mind when you're operating. It's very important.
And you mentioned it earlier when you were talking about the recreational test that's coming up. We've partnered with industry to start to develop those things, and everything we do is a partnership. And we find that things flow much better and the operations become much safer as we partner with other people.
Yep, right, absolutely. We're kind of all in this together, right? Yep, right. Facebook, question coming in from Jason. Jason asks, I am a Part 107 licensed carrier and work for a local news source as a drone operator. What are the rules surrounding if you are responding to the area of a traffic accident? This is sort of a hot topic, really, in a lot of ways coming up. I'll start off here. In deference here to John, what he's been talking about, airspace is important to you. You need to know what airspace you're flying in. Are you flying in controlled airspace, or uncontrolled airspace. Because if that traffic accident or whatever you need to film is in controlled airspace, you're going to need an airspace authorization, as we've been talking here through most of the live Q&A. If it's uncontrolled airspace, you may be okay to fly. One thing with filming accidents or areas that have first responder or police activity there, it's absolutely imperative that you do not interfere with what they're trying to do. They are there trying to save lives or trying to do significant, very important, detailed work. And sometimes flying a drone on there is not only distracting at a minimum, but it could be hazardous. If you're flying the drone, you don't know if an emergency medical helicopter is inbound to make a landing and pick up somebody to move away. Certainly, it's sort of maybe look at it in the same way that you would if you were filming. If you showed up and you're setting up your tripod, where would the police or first responders want you to be so that you can get the shot you need? So we don't want to restrict people from being able to broadcast their news, but certainly we don't want you interfering with the relief efforts. So when it comes to flying your drone near traffic accidents or emergency operations, exercise extreme caution for how you do that. Because we want you not only to be safe, but we don't want you to interfere with any of the response, relief, or recovery or rescue efforts that are happening.
Well, and the other thing you need to think about is the fact that depending on what you're filming, how large the accident is, what it is, the event that's going on, there may also be temporary flight restrictions in place that you need to make sure that you're aware of so that you don't fly into those areas where you shouldn't be.
Yep, excellent. And John, we've got time for one more question. I'm going to give this one to you, buddy. This comes in on Facebook. It's from Brian. He asks, what is the proper procedure for flying in controlled airspace with an authorization through the drone zone? Do we still need to contact air traffic control before and after we fly?
So, as a general rule, the answer to that would be no. There are some cases where the air traffic control facilities have specifically requested those contacts, and that's done in times where you may be flying above the facility map altitudes or something like that, where the air traffic control facility specifically wants to know when you're in the air and when you're down on the ground. But as a general rule, the answer is no. You do not have a requirement to contact the facility unless your authorization specifically says so.
All right, so it's really important to take a look at that authorization that you get and see what requirements, what conditions or limitations that might be on that.
Right.
So great. Well, unfortunately, we're out of time because I say unfortunately because this has been really great for John and I to sit here and have these questions come in. You folks are sending in some absolutely fantastic questions, and we really wish we could sit here, well, at least I'll speak for myself, sit here all day and answer questions for you folks, but we are running out of time. If you did submit a question and we were unfortunately not able to answer it here live today, we are taking a look at all those questions, and we will get that information posted and make sure you get the information back that you need to continue operating safely. So from here in Washington, D.C., on behalf of John and myself and the entire FAA, we thank you so much for joining us for this live Q&A. We do hope to see you again in the future, and until next time, fly safe.